My name is Rahim. I was born in Qom, Iran, into a family that had memorized prayers before they could even spell their own names. My father, a respected cleric, was a stern man, disciplined, exacting, and deeply committed to the teachings of Islam. From the time I could speak, I was taught how to recite the daily prayers, 5 times a day, bowing toward Mecca with the precision of a soldier and the heart of a son trying to win his father's approval. I became that soldier literally. I joined the military at the age of 20 and rose through the ranks, eventually earning the title of colonel. I was proud of my uniform, not only because it symbolized power, but because it made my father proud. Respect in our town was measured by devotion and duty, and I wore both like armor. My wife, Layla, came from a similarly devout family. We met through an arrangement by our parents. She was quiet, obedient, a woman of sharp intelligence who carried her faith like a veil, soft but impenetrable. We married young, as was expected, and over time, our home filled with the sounds of our children, first Hassan, then little Nada. We lived in a modest but well-kept house just off one of the main roads leading out of the city. I spent most days either on base or inspecting border stations. At night, I returned to a house where the Quran was always open, its verses echoing from the mouths of my children as they practiced their recitations under Layla's watchful eye. Our life revolved around the mosque. Every Friday, we attended congregational prayers. Our community gathered not just to worship, but to solidify unity, a unity that depended on conformity. Divergence was not just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Children were taught to report blasphemy. Neighbors watched each other more closely than they watched their own children. Still, I never questioned it. Faith, I believed, was obedience, and obedience was righteousness. My hands were rarely idle. When I wasn't serving in the military, I worked on old cars. Mechanics has always fascinated me. Maybe because machines, unlike people, followed clear laws. If something didn't work, there was always a reason for fuel, wiring, parts. I taught my son Hassan how to tighten bolts and diagnose engine problems before he turned 10. Our garage was our sanctuary, one of the few places I felt the burden of my rank fall away. But even there, under oil-streaked lights and the scent of diesel, we kept a radio nearby that played religious lectures from Tehran, just in case the neighbors were listening through the window. Every morning began the same. I rose before dawn, performed wudu, and stood facing the Qibla with my prayer rug unrolled. The rhythm of the words, the movements, the silence between them had all become muscle memory. I believed, or at least I believed. Doubt was a luxury I could not afford. I had a reputation to maintain, a father whose pride defined my worth, a family whose security depended on my unwavering loyalty not just to the country, but to the faith. Looking back, I can see the cracks that had begun forming in those years. They were small at first, a hesitation before prayer, a fleeting feeling that the words felt more like performance than praise. But I buried them beneath the demands of duty. When my father fell ill and I stood by his bedside reciting verses while he could no longer speak, I told myself that God was listening. When my daughter cried from nightmares and I placed my hand on her head, whispering Ayat al-Kursi, I told myself that the verses would protect her. That was my role. Protector, provider, believer. But there were moments I still can't explain, moments that pressed like weights on my chest. Once, during a raid on a small village suspected of harboring political dissidents, I found an old man kneeling over a fire, not resisting, just praying. But the prayer wasn't in Arabic, and it wasn't to Allah. He spoke the name of Isa Jesus, and something in his voice made my hands tremble. I ordered the younger soldiers to move on and left the man unharmed. I didn't know why. Later that night I couldn't sleep. The way the old man had looked at me, not with fear, but pity, stayed with me for weeks. I never spoke of it. Not even to Layla. We didn't talk about things like that. I was the man of the house, a decorated officer. My role was to lead, to suppress doubt, not to entertain it. But inside me, something had started to shift, like a loose screw in an engine barely noticeable at first, but dangerous if left unaddressed. At night, when the house was quiet and the call to prayer echoed faintly in the distance, I sometimes stared at the ceiling and asked questions I didn't dare speak aloud. Is this all there is? Am I only what others see? Why do I feel empty even when I'm doing everything right? I buried those questions the way my people had always buried shame, with silence and more devotion. I fasted more days. I gave more to charity. I corrected my son more harshly when he skipped prayer. I enforced discipline at the barracks with greater intensity. I convinced myself that doubt was weakness, and weakness was a betrayal of everything I was. But in the deepest parts of me, those that no prayer rug could cover, I was already unraveling. And I didn't know then that this unraveling would lead me down a path that would cost me everything. My family, my freedom, my country. What happened next changed my life forever. It started with a cough, dry, persistent, harmless at first. Layla brushed it off as a seasonal cold. Nothing that a bit of honey and black seed oil couldn't fix. But within weeks, her skin turned pale and her energy vanished. She stopped waking early for Fajr prayers, which unsettled me more than I admitted. My wife was the backbone of our home, the one who never faltered. To see her struggle to climb stairs or carry groceries was like watching the walls of our house crack in slow motion. Doctors in Qom were hesitant, vague. They ordered tests, scribbled prescriptions, and told us to be patient. But when I saw the oncologist's expression, the pause in his voice before he said, "advanced stage," I knew the truth long before he confirmed it. Cancer. Aggressive. Inoperable. I drove home that night in silence. The streets were lit with golden lamplight and the echoes of evening prayers. I parked in front of our house and stared at the front door, unable to move. How could I walk in and tell my children their mother was dying? How could I tell Layla that all the du'as, the charity, the prayers hadn't stopped this? I tried to keep the house functioning, to protect the children from the reality unraveling around them. I cooked when I could, recited prayers at Layla's bedside, and still showed up in uniform to lead morning drills at the base. But inside, I was breaking. My hands, once steady on rifles and engines, now shook when I laced my boots. My voice, once loud with command, now cracked when I spoke to my daughter. I no longer recognized the man in the mirror. One night, I found myself in our garage, sitting on a wooden stool beside Hassan's disassembled bicycle. The garage used to be a place of clarity for me, where things made sense. But not that night. I picked up a wrench and stared at it, willing to explain why a woman who prayed 5 times a day, who covered herself with dignity, who served others without complaint, why she had to suffer like this. The wrench, of course, said nothing. The next day, I took Layla to the shrine of Fatima Masume. Thousands go there seeking healing. I had seen men break down sobbing in that courtyard, hands raised in pleading. I had watched women bring water from the well, believing it held power. I believed it too. I had to. I pressed my forehead to the stone floor and begged, not with the practiced rhythm of prayer, but with desperation. Please, spare her, I'll do anything. There was no answer. Weeks passed, and Layla grew weaker. Her voice was barely audible, her eyes dulled. One morning, I caught her trying to hide blood in a handkerchief, her lips trembling. I took it from her gently, my hand closing over hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew time was running out. Hassan began asking questions. Why doesn't Allah help Mama? Why doesn't the shrine heal her? I told him not to speak like that, but inside I echoed his questions. I began avoiding the mosque. I still prayed, but the words felt hollow. I went through the motions like a man wearing someone else's skin, and yet I feared stopping altogether, as if abandoning those routines would bring even greater punishment. One night, after Layla had fallen asleep and the children were tucked in, I stepped out into the courtyard alone. The sky above Qom was thick with stars. I looked up and whispered, "Are you even there?" Not to Allah, not really, not to anyone in particular, just to the void. The silence that followed was deafening. The next day, something unusual happened. A mechanic I knew, Hamid, stopped by the garage to ask if I had a certain carburetor part. We hadn't spoken in months, but he lingered, fidgeting with a greasy rag in his hand. He looked nervous. I asked what was wrong. He looked over his shoulder and lowered his voice. "Rahim, I heard about Layla. I know someone, a man. He prays in a different way. People say strange things happen when he prays. Healing things." He paused. "He's not a mullah." I stared at him. I knew what he was implying. There are few things more dangerous in Iran than being associated with house churches or underground believers. Even suggesting such a thing could cost you your job, your freedom, or worse. "Get out," I said quietly. Hamid nodded. "I understand." He turned to go, but before he reached the door, he looked back. "Just think about it. What do you have to lose?" I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying his words. What did I have to lose? My position, my reputation, maybe my life. But what about Layla? She was already slipping away. And I realized something I hadn't dared admit even to myself. I didn't care about protocol anymore. I didn't care what was allowed or forbidden. I just wanted her to live. The next morning, I visited Hamid's shop before sunrise. He didn't say anything, just nodded. He handed me a folded piece of paper with an address, no name, and no phone number. That address would take me to a small house on the outskirts of town, and what happened there would shatter every belief I had ever held. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that the foundation of my life, the prayers, the traditions, the identity I'd worn so proudly was cracking beneath my feet, and I was about to step into a truth that would burn everything down. I went alone. I told Layla I had to check on a delivery at the motor pool and kissed her forehead before leaving. She was too weak to question me, too tired to read the worry in my eyes. I slipped through the alleys of Qom like a man carrying contraband, checking over my shoulder at every corner. The address led to a house on the far edge of the city, near where the concrete faded into dust, and shepherds walked their flocks along forgotten roads. It was unremarkable, clay walls, rusted gates, no signs, no banners, nothing that marked it as different. And yet everything about it felt foreign, dangerous. I knocked once, twice. The door creaked open, and a man in his 50s greeted me with warm eyes and weathered hands. He didn't ask who I was or why I came. He simply stepped aside and said, "You are welcome here." Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. A few men and women sat on cushions around a low table, their heads bowed in silence. There were no Qurans, no prayer beads, no pictures of imams, just a simple wooden cross hanging from the far wall. I froze. The cross pierced something in me. Not fear, not yet, but a deep unease, as if I had just stepped off the edge of a cliff without knowing how far I would fall. The man who greeted me introduced himself only as Daniel. He wasn't Iranian, I guessed Armenian or Assyrian, maybe. His accent was soft, and when he spoke it was like someone tuning an instrument I didn't know had gone out of tune inside me. "I know you are burdened," he said. "You can speak freely here." I didn't speak. I couldn't. My tongue felt nailed to my doubts. But he didn't press. Instead, he opened a small book, its cover worn, the pages frayed at the edges, and began reading in Farsi. It wasn't the Quran. I knew that instantly. The rhythm was different, the words strange, but something in them resonated like a hidden frequency. It was the Gospel of Luke. He read of a woman who had bled for 12 years, who touched the edge of Jesus' cloak and was healed. I didn't understand it, not fully, but something inside me cracked. That woman had been unclean, unwanted, unseen. But Jesus, Isa, had seen her and healed her. When Daniel finished, he closed the book and looked at me. "Do you want us to pray for your wife?" I should have said no. I should have walked out. I should have remembered the uniform in my closet, the oath I had sworn, the eyes watching every corner of this city. But all I could do was nod. They stood around me and placed their hands on my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I felt a kind of prayer that wasn't ritual, wasn't performance. It wasn't in Arabic. It wasn't chanted. It was raw, real. They spoke to Isa Jesus as if he was right there with us. And the strangest thing was, it felt like he was. Daniel placed a hand over my heart and prayed in Farsi. "Lord Jesus, show Rahim that you see him, that you love him, that you can do what no shrine and no ritual can." I wept. For the first time since I was a boy, I cried not from fear or shame, but from something deeper hunger. I wanted this Jesus. I didn't understand him, but I wanted him. If he was real, if he could see me the way he saw that woman in the story, if he could heal Layla, then I would follow him, even if it cost me everything. They gave me a small book of the New Testament in Farsi wrapped in a cloth. I tucked it deep in my coat and slipped away into the dusk, heart pounding like I'd just committed treason. Maybe I had. When I got home, Layla was asleep. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath a thread fraying at the edge. I didn't know what I believed yet. I didn't know what I had stepped into. But I knelt by the bed, opened the small book, and whispered a prayer I made up as I went. "Jesus, if you're real, heal her. Please. I don't know who you are, but I need you. She needs you." The next morning, Layla sat up in bed on her own, for the first time in weeks. Her voice was stronger. Her eyes are clearer. She asked for soup. Her fever had broken. She held my hand and said, "I had a dream last night, of light. It touched me." I said nothing, but I felt something break open inside me. Over the next few days, she improved rapidly. The doctors were baffled. They called it an anomaly. One even suggested there had been a misdiagnosis. But I knew. I knew something had happened that couldn't be explained by science or fate or protocol. Someone had intervened. That night, I returned to the small house and told Daniel what had happened. He smiled. "This is only the beginning." I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought it meant more healing, more peace, more light. But what I didn't know was that the same light that had healed Layla would soon expose everything. And once that light touched my soul, I could never go back. I had crossed a line, not with words, not with declarations, but with my heart. And in my country, in my uniform, that was enough to make me a traitor. In the days that followed Layla's recovery, I lived in two worlds. By daylight, I remained Colonel Rahim, the trusted officer, the loyal servant of the Islamic Republic. I wore my uniform like armor, my beard trimmed to regulation, my speech lined with the correct phrases, Insha'Allah, Alhamdulillah, Subhanallah. I led drills with my soldiers and offered public prayers with a voice that boomed with practiced conviction. No one suspected anything. They couldn't. If even a whisper of doubt clung to your name in Hume, it could spread like wildfire, reducing everything you'd built to ash. But when night fell and the house was quiet, I would slip into the garage, our sanctuary, once again. I kept the New Testament hidden inside a rusted toolbox, tucked beneath old spark plugs and greasy rags. I would sit on the cracked stool, lean over the book by the glow of a weak bulb, and read until my hands ached from turning pages. The words cut through me, gentler than a blade, but sharper than truth. Verses that I had once dismissed as foreign, corrupted, or dangerous now breathed life into my lungs like air I never knew I was missing. I didn't tell Layla, at least not at first. She knew something was different in me. She often caught me staring at her with tears in my eyes, or quietly humming a melody I'd picked up from one of the house gatherings. But I couldn't bring myself to say it. That I was beginning to believe in Jesus, not just as a prophet, but as the Son of God. That I was praying in His name, that I felt Him answering. I knew what this meant. Conversion was not just frowned upon, it was treason, apostasy. Under Islamic law in Iran, the punishment is death. And not just for the convert, their family too could suffer, be shamed, harassed, disgraced. So I stayed silent. I smiled in public. I repeated the Shahada out loud while whispering, "Jesus, help me," in my heart. But my silence couldn't last. One evening, Layla found the book. She was looking for extra towels in the garage and opened the wrong box. I walked in just as she pulled the cloth away from the New Testament, her eyes narrowing with confusion. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cautious, not angry yet. I froze. My instinct told me to lie, to say it belonged to a friend, that it was for research, anything. But I couldn't. Not to her, not anymore. "It's the Injil," I said, "the Gospel." Her hands trembled. "You've been reading this?" I nodded. She sank onto the stool. "Rahim, do you know what this means?" "I do," I said. "And I also know He healed you. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Jesus, He's not just a prophet. He's alive. He touched you." She said nothing for a long time. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't weep. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I felt it too." I looked at her, stunned. "What do you mean?" She reached out and took my hand. "That dream I told you about the light wasn't just light. There was a man. I couldn't see his face, but he called me by name. And when he touched me, I felt warmth in my bones. Peace, like I was being rewritten. My heart pounded. "You believe it was him?" She nodded slowly. "I don't know what to believe, but I know it wasn't a lie." We sat there for hours, holding hands, whispering truths we dared not speak aloud. That night, for the first time, we prayed together not the prayers we'd memorized as children, but simple words, honest words. We thanked Jesus for healing. We asked Him to guide us. we asked Him to protect us. It was the most dangerous prayer I had ever prayed. In the weeks that followed, our home became a sanctuary in the truest sense. I led secret readings with Layla after the children were asleep. We took turns studying the Gospels, marveling at every parable like travelers discovering a hidden country. We whispered prayers over Hassan and Nada as they slept, asking Jesus to watch over them, even though they didn't yet know who He truly was. Eventually, I returned to the house church. I brought Layla with me. They welcomed her like a sister already known. She cried through the whole gathering. She later told me she had never felt so accepted, so seen, even in a room of strangers. And yet, beneath the peace, a storm brewed. One evening, Daniel pulled me aside after a gathering. "You must be careful," he said. "Your position, your name, people watch." "I know," I replied. "We're cautious." "No one is truly safe here," he said, "but especially not you." I understood what he meant. If word ever reached the base command, if a neighbor ever reported suspicious behavior, if a cousin with ties to the Basij heard a strange whisper, we would be finished. So I tightened the circle. No more gatherings at the same house twice. We stopped visiting the house church for a time. We memorized verses so we wouldn't need to carry the book. I changed the lockbox in the garage. And yet, I felt joy like I never had before. In the quiet moments when Layla and I would listen to a whispered recording of the Psalms in Farsi, or when Nada unknowingly sang a melody I'd hummed from a worship chorus, I felt alive. The risks were real, but so was the spirit in our home. Still, something inside warned me. This peace would not last. One night, after returning from the base, I found a note slipped under our door. It read only 3 words, scrawled in blocky pen, "We see you." I didn't know who had written it. I didn't know if it was a bluff, a neighbor, or a cruel joke. But I did know that our secret faith was no longer fully secret, and the cost was coming. For 3 days after the note arrived, I slept with a pistol under my pillow. Old habits returned like shadows at dusk. I began checking the curtains every hour. I scanned rooftops as I walked through the bazaar, listening for footsteps that followed too closely. I watched my children more carefully, how they spoke, what they said, especially at school, not because I didn't trust them, but because I knew how the system worked. Children had been trained to report suspicious conversations, even in their own homes. I knew that better than anyone. I had taught those very interrogation techniques to junior officers years ago. My father visited unexpectedly that week. His health had worsened since his stroke, but his mind remained sharp, and his eyes, though dimmed by age, still held that piercing judgment I had grown up under. He asked why Layla hadn't been at the women's prayer gatherings. He noticed the lack of Quranic recitation playing on the radio. He walked into the garage and my heart stopped and asked why it smelled like burnt paper. I lied. I said I had burned old car manuals. I hated myself for how easily the words came. But I knew then. The cracks were showing. That same evening, Hassan came home from school, quiet, unsettled. I asked him what was wrong. He hesitated, then finally said, "Baba." The teacher asked what religion we are. My stomach clenched. "And what did you say?" I said, "Muslim," but she kept asking questions. She said we don't talk like the other kids. She said you've stopped coming to the mosque. I knelt in front of him. "Listen to me. If anyone ever asks again, you say we are Muslim. Don't ask questions, don't explain. Just say it. Do you understand?" He nodded, but his eyes filled with confusion. "But I thought we followed Jesus now." I pulled him into my arms. "We do, but not everyone understands. Not everyone is safe to tell. For now, it must be our secret." I held him tighter than I ever had. My son, the boy who once giggled while I taught him to change a tire, now carried the burden of our faith in silence. And he was only 11. That night, I returned to the garage and opened the lockbox. The New Testament was still there, but beside it was something I hadn't put there: a matchstick. Just one, resting on top of the pages. I stood still for a long time. Someone had opened it. Someone had been inside. The next day at the base, I was summoned by Major Solari, my superior, and a man I had served under for nearly 15 years. We'd fought together in border conflicts, shared tea and stories late into the night. He looked at me differently now, less like a brother-in-arms, more like a man confirming rumors. "Colonel Rahim," he said slowly, "we've received reports, nothing formal yet, but whispers, that your family has been seen with questionable elements, that your wife was observed entering a known Armenian quarter, that your behavior at the mosque has changed." I kept my face still, my voice calm. "My wife was ill. We have kept to ourselves during her recovery. As for the mosque, I have prayed there since I was a boy. If someone claims otherwise, they are mistaken." He leaned forward. "You know what I must do if these rumors gain weight." I nodded. "I understand." He paused. Then, with something like regret in his eyes, he said, "Be careful, Rahim. Even the wind can carry accusations in this city." When I returned home, I knew we had to act. I pulled Layla aside and told her everything: the visit from my father, the questions at school, the matchstick, the conversation at the base. Her face paled. "We have to leave," she whispered. "We can't," I said. "Not yet. Leaving suddenly would draw more suspicion. We need a plan." That week, I destroyed every Christian recording we had. I burned worship CDs. I deleted files from our old phone. I moved the New Testament to a hidden panel beneath the floorboards of the garage, wrapped in plastic just in case. We stopped attending the house gatherings. We stopped meeting Daniel. But fear had already entered our home. 2 weeks later, the knock came. Not at the door, but the gate. 3 men, black coats, no insignia. They didn't announce themselves as Basage or Revolutionary Guard. They didn't have to. I opened the door, heart thudding. "Can I help you?" One of them smiled thinly. "Colonel Rahim, we've received a complaint. Religious misconduct. Would you be willing to come with us for questioning?" Behind me, I heard Layla gasp. I turned and looked her in the eyes, then turned back to the men. "I'll come." They placed a black hood over my head, not roughly, but firmly. As they led me away, I thought of my children eating breakfast without knowing their father might never come home again. I thought of the verses I had memorized, now hidden beneath our home, waiting in the dark. I thought of Jesus, silent during his trial, and I whispered under my breath, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." What came next would tear everything apart. But even as the vehicle sped away into the unknown, a strange peace settled in my chest. The eyes had found us. And now, everything would be revealed. The room they took me to was beneath the earth, cold, damp, and without windows. A single bulb swung overhead, its flickering light casting long shadows across the concrete floor. I had seen rooms like this before. Years ago, I stood on the other side of the table, asking questions, reading names, watching for the twitch of a lie. Now I was the one in the chair, arms bound, head bowed not by pain yet, but by the weight of what I had already lost. They didn't speak at first. The silence was a tactic. Let the prisoner stew in his own thoughts. Let fear do the interrogation. But I had been trained for this. I knew their games. What I hadn't been trained for was the calm that settled over me despite the fear. I prayed not out loud, not in Arabic, but in the quiet of my mind. Lord Jesus, I'm yours. The questions came next. Are you still a Muslim? Yes, I said, I was, at least in the eyes of the state. That was how I survived the first round. Do you believe in the finality of the Prophet Muhammad? I respect him. Have you met with Christians in your home? No. That was technically true, not recently. Have you read the Injil? I hesitated. They didn't need my answer. The pause was enough. They brought in my military file, thick and pristine, marked with commendations. They showed me a printed photo, blurry but unmistakable, of Layla, walking near the Armenian quarter, scarf slipping slightly, eyes alert. Another photo, grainy air, me stepping into a house church. They already knew. The questions were only to confirm what they needed for the next step. Confession. When I didn't give it, they moved on. They stripped me to my undershirt. They bound my hands behind my back and pressed my face to the concrete floor. A baton came down on my back, then again. And again, not wild blows, measured ones. Designed not to kill, but to wear me down. I didn't cry out. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Every strike was like fire across my ribs. I had interrogated men who cried out for mercy. I understand now that pain doesn't scream, it whispers. It whispers doubts into your soul, convincing you to give up just to make it stop. But as the blows landed, I remembered Gethsemane. I remembered the garden, the blood, the silence. I remembered the Christ who had suffered without sin. And I prayed through clenched teeth, let me not deny you. When they were tired, they left me there. Hours passed, maybe more. Time didn't exist in that room. A single cockroach skittered across the wall. I watched it and wept, not from pain, but from knowing Layla didn't know where I was. Hassan and Nada would come home from school and find an empty house. The next day, if it was day, they brought me to another room. This one had chairs. A man in a gray suit sat behind a desk. He spoke gently. You're a good man, Colonel Rahim. A patriot. You have served with honor. This is not who you are. I said nothing. We can help you. We can protect your family. But we need your cooperation. He slid a document across the table, a confession, stating I had been misled by foreign missionaries, that I repented, that I remained loyal to Islam and the Republic. I stared at the paper. My hands trembled. I won't sign, I said. He nodded slowly, as if disappointed. We don't want to escalate this. I won't deny him. He sighed. Then you force our hand. They transferred me to Evan Prison 2 days later. I was thrown into a cell with 5 other men, 2 political prisoners, 1 opium addict, and a silent old man who didn't speak at all. The air was thick with sweat and mildew. At night, rats skittered across the floor. During the day, the guards read the names of prisoners scheduled for public lashes or worse. I was never officially charged. Apostasy cases are handled quietly. But word spread. Guards began calling me Murtad Apostate. They spat at my food tray. One urinated near my sleeping mat. They stopped letting me bathe. Humiliation became a language they spoke fluently. And yet, Jesus never left me. I whispered his name in the silence. I recited verses I had memorized under the oil-streaked garage bulb. I repeated Psalm 23 over and over. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Sometimes, at night, I would feel a warmth in my chest like the hand of the man Layla described in her dream. I would see his light in my mind, cutting through the darkness of that cell, and I would sleep in peace even as rats gnawed at my blanket. One night, a young guard pulled me from my cell. I thought it was another beating. Instead, he led me to a hallway and pressed a piece of paper into my hand. It was a note. 3 words. She is safe. I looked at him. My cousin, he whispered. She knew your wife. She escaped with the children. I nearly collapsed. Tears streamed down my face. I had feared the worst, that they had taken Layla too, that they had punished my family for my faith, but they had escaped. The guard never spoke to me again. He never looked me in the eye, but I knew God had used him. Even here, even in this place, Jesus was at work. After 78 days, I was released. No trial, no explanation. Just a bag of my belongings and a stern warning. Leave Qom. Stay silent. They thought they were silencing me. But what they didn't understand is this. When you've met the living Christ, no prison can contain your voice. I walked out of that gate with broken ribs, a limp, and scars I'll carry for the rest of my life. But I also walked out for free in a way they would never understand. I didn't go back to Qom. My hometown, once the very center of my identity, was now a name I could only whisper in memory. The day I left prison, I headed west toward Kermanshah, using back roads, paying cash at every stop, my face wrapped in an old scarf to avoid recognition. I was no longer a colonel. I was no longer Rahim, the respected officer. Rahim, the son of a cleric. I was a fugitive, a ghost, dust without a flag. The hardest part was not knowing where Layla and the children were. I repeated the guard's words, "She is safe," over and over like a mantra, but I had no proof, no message, no direction. For 2 weeks, I stayed in a small village near the Iraq border, sleeping in barns and earning food by fixing old engines and broken radios. I prayed every night for a sign, just one clue. It came on the 15th day. A boy, maybe 12, ran into the workshop where I was replacing the carburetor of a tractor. He handed me a folded piece of paper and darted away without a word. I opened it with trembling fingers. A single line written in Layla's handwriting. Kurdistan. Safe house. Mercy clinic. Come. I nearly collapsed. She was alive. She had made it out with the children. Somehow, by the hand of God, she had escaped. That night, I paid a smuggler with everything I had, my watch, my ring, my military insignia to take me across the border. The journey was brutal. We traveled by foot through mountain passes where the cold bit through my skin like knives. One man in our group, a young refugee fleeing conscription, died from exposure during the second night. We buried him under a pile of rocks, whispering prayers none of us really knew how to say. But I kept walking. I had to. 3 days later, I arrived in Sulaymaniyah. Kurdistan was a world apart. The language, the customs, even the air felt unfamiliar, like waking up in a new body. But the people at Mercy Clinic didn't ask questions. They knew the type of wounds that didn't show on X-rays. The director, a quiet woman from Syria, took one look at me and said, "You've seen fire, but you're still standing. That means God has a reason." They led me through a back corridor and opened a door. Layla stood there, holding Nada in her arms. Hassan sat beside her, older than I remembered, face thinner, eyes harder. When they saw me, Nada screamed, "Baba!" and ran into my arms. I held her like a man clutching the last piece of a life that had crumbled beyond repair. Layla wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time since the beatings, I let myself cry without shame. We were together, alive, scarred, but whole. We stayed at the safe house under assumed names. My limp made labor difficult, but I began fixing appliances and generators for the other refugees. Layla helped in the clinic, comforting the sick, cleaning wounds, whispering prayers in the name of the one who had spared her life. We didn't preach, we didn't pass out tracts. We simply lived openly, this time with the quiet joy of people who had nothing to prove but everything to share. Some days were unbearable. Hassan didn't speak to me for weeks. He resented that we had lost everything: our home, our country, his school, his friends. He missed his grandfather, even though the old man would likely have condemned us to death had he known the truth. But slowly, he began to understand. One night, I found him reading the Gospel of John in Farsi. He looked up at me and asked, "Did Jesus also lose his family?" "Yes," I told him, "and still, he forgave the ones who took them." We sat in silence for a long time, then he nodded. Just once. That was the moment I knew the exile had not broken him. It had opened him. As refugees, we had no rights, no citizenship, no path forward, only the present moment. But in that moment, Jesus became not just our Savior but our companion, our provider, our peace. Once, while repairing a generator in a church basement, I met a man from the north, an Iraqi pastor who had smuggled Bibles into Iran for years. When I told him my story, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You were a soldier once. You still are, but now for a different kingdom." A month later, he invited me to speak to a small group of displaced believers, Kurds, Syrians, Iraqis, even one Afghan who had walked alone for 6 weeks to get there. I stood before them, trembling, unworthy, and told the truth. I was once a man of law. Now, I was a man of grace. I once enforced rules. Now, I preached mercy. I had sentenced others with my silence. Now, I bore witness with my voice. That day, a seed was planted. From then on, I began speaking at gatherings. Small at first, just 6 or 7 people around a table. Then, larger ones hid in tents in the hills, shelters under bridges, candlelit rooms in refugee compounds. Each time, I told my story not to impress, not to convert, but to remind them that suffering is not the end. That exile is not abandonment, that Jesus walks with the exiled, that he became one of us. And each time, someone would come up afterward and whisper, "I thought I was alone, but now I know I'm not." We still live without status, without a home. Our children speak 3 languages now but carry no passport. We are marked by a country that calls us traitors, but claimed by a kingdom that calls us sons and daughters. I miss Iran every day. The smell of saffron rice in the morning, the echo of the azan at dawn, the sound of my mother humming while she made bread. But I don't miss who I was there. That man died in a prison cell, in a courtroom of lies, in the silence of betrayal. And what rose from his grave was something new, not a colonel, a servant. I still wake up before the sun. The habit never left me. Even now, in this dusty apartment above a falafel shop in a Kurdish border town, my body rises like it remembers another life, another uniform, another world. But now, instead of rolling out a prayer rug and facing Mecca, I rise in silence, kneel by the window, and whisper the name that changed everything. Jesus, here I am. The city outside is a patchwork of the displaced: Syrians, Afghans, Iranians, Yazidi souls, shuffled like cards by wars, by borders, by politics. No one belongs here, but we've made belonging from brokenness. The man who runs the bakery downstairs lost his leg to a mine in Mosul. The woman across the alley hasn't heard from her husband in 4 years. We all carry grief in our bones. But somehow, Jesus keeps showing up among the ruins. After my release and our exile, I had imagined our life might settle into quiet anonymity, that we would simply survive, keep our heads down, rebuild, remain hidden. But it didn't stay that way. Something in me refused to go silent. The fire they tried to beat out of me had only moved deeper into the marrow. And soon, others began to notice. A young man came to me first. His name was Yusuf. He had seen me speak at the underground gathering in Suleymaniya and asked if I would meet his father, a former Shia cleric who had lost his faith during the war, but couldn't quite shake his longing for God. We met in a tent, just outside the refugee compound, beneath a single kerosene lantern. The man was skeptical at first, full of questions, full of pain. But when I told him what Jesus had done for Layla, how he had met me not with condemnation but with presence, the man wept. Not like a convert, like a son coming home. Word spread, slowly but steadily. I was cautious. The authorities still patrolled the region. Informants lurked in unexpected places, but the hunger was undeniable. Men with faces like mine, wearing the same scars, began asking me to pray for their wives, their children, their wounds. They brought me tea and broken questions, and I brought them Jesus, not with sermons, not with tracts, but with stories, with scars. Layla and I began hosting a small gathering once a week. We called it Majlis-e-Omid, the Circle of Hope. It wasn't a church in the traditional sense. No cross on the wall, no altar, just mats on the floor, whispered worship, Bibles passed from hand to trembling hand. We shared food, lentils, flatbread, dates. We shared testimony. And somehow, always, the presence of Jesus would fill that room like fragrance. I started writing letters, dozens, then hundreds. Some for believers still inside Iran, passed hand to hand like contraband. Others for those in prison, smuggled through lawyers and sympathetic guards. I wrote to those awaiting execution, reminding them they were not forgotten, that the same Christ who met me in the dark would meet them too. Some never wrote back. Some were martyred. Their names are burned into my prayers like incense on stone. Hassan is older now, nearly a man. He teaches English to other refugee children and dreams of becoming a translator one day. But sometimes I see him watching me when I pray, a quiet knowing in his eyes. He doesn't talk much about Qom or what we lost, but one night, as we walked home from the safe house after teaching, he slipped his arm around my shoulders and said, "Baba, thank you for not hiding anymore." Nada dances now. In the safe house courtyard, when no one is watching, she spins in the sunlight and sings little songs she makes up on the spot, half in Kurdish, half in Farsi, always with joy. Layla says she carries the spirit of resurrection. I believe her. And Layla. Oh, Layla. The woman who once barely had the strength to rise from bed now preaches life with every breath. She comforts women who've been widowed, counsels girls orphaned by war, and prays with boldness that puts mine to shame. She has become a spiritual mother to many of our homes, a tent of meeting for the weary. I no longer mourn what we lost. Not in the same way. There are days when the ache returns when I hear a Persian lullaby on the radio or smell saffron and rosewater from a nearby stall and feel tears sting my eyes before I even understand why. But grief has become a friend now, not an enemy. It reminds me I have loved deeply and been transformed by pain. That my scars are not signs of failure, but of faithfulness. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wish I could return. If I would go back to the life of respect, of uniform, of safety, and I tell them, I did not lose a country, I gained a kingdom. I do not serve a government anymore, I serve a king who washed the feet of traitors, who touched lepers, who called out from a cross, forgive them. I was sentenced to death in Qom, but I was born again in exile. I should not be alive. I should not be free, but by the grace of Jesus Christ, I am both. And as long as I have breath, I will speak, not to seek revenge, not to stir revolt, but to say this, He is worth everything, the beatings, the exile, the fear, the loss, He is worth it. If you are reading this, or watching this, or hearing my voice somewhere in the back room of a compound with the curtains drawn, know this, you are not alone. He sees you, He is with you. In the silence, in the cell, in sorrow, and His love, once it finds you, will never let you go. Not in Qum, not in Kurdistan, not in death, not ever.